This video is for the DBQ reading of documents number 7 through 12. Document number 7. Captured at age 11, Olaudah Equiano from his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African, written by himself. Your first question. What happened to Olaudah Equiano and his sister when he was 11 years old? From the passage, quote, One day, when all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both, without giving us time to cry out or make resistance. They stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could, until night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. The next morning, we left the house and continued traveling all the day. For a long time we had kept to the woods, but at last we came into a road which I believed I knew. I had now some hopes of being delivered, for we had advanced but a little way before I discovered some people at a distance, on which I began to cry out for their assistance, but my cries had no other effect than to make them tie me faster and to stop my mouth, and then they put me into a large sack. So the first question for this passage is asking, what happened to Olaudah Equiano and his sister when he was 11 years old? And then the second question is asking, how were they treated? And you want to pick any 2 details that stood out to you based off of the passage that I just read. Document 8. Slave Barracoon from the Congo is the top picture. Slave Barracoon in Sierra Leone is the bottom sketch. What is a barracoon? And your vocabulary is at the very first page, so you go back to the vocabulary. A barracoon, an enclosure or barracks used for the temporary confinement or imprisonment of slaves, while slave traders waited to transport them. It's called a barracoon. Based off of these sketches, write 3 details that you notice from these images. Think about how these people were being treated, how they're kept into submission, and how they're monitored or guarded. So this is where they're kept until they're actually put on the ships to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Document number 9. Plan of the British slave ship Brooks. This is the view from above looking down under the top deck. Where were the slaves placed on the ship? Which deck, the top or the bottom? And why do you think slaves were placed there in that way? And here's the reading. Enslaved people were often placed on the bottom deck of the ship and only brought out onto the top deck in smaller groups when necessary. They were laid down loose fit on their backs or bellies, or laid down tight fit on their sides to lay even more people down next to each other. Slave decks often had multi-level wooden bunks to fit more people. Slaves were often chained to the bunks and to each other. The bottom deck had little light and little fresh air. The enslaved people could not get up and walk around on the bottom deck. They were forced to soil themselves or go to the restroom on themselves. So again, you're answering, where were the slaves placed on the ship, on the top deck or the bottom? And why do you think they were placed there in that way? And the last question, what issues or problems would these people have on the ship because of their location or where or how they're placed during the long journey? Think about the conditions that were described here in that passage that would affect their voyage or like the experience that they have. Document 10. Thomas Phillips, a slave ship captain, an account from a journal of a voyage, 1746. The first question. According to Captain Phillips, what were some of the punishments for slaves who were resistant or rebellious on the ships? And the second question. Why wouldn't Captain Phillips do these things while he was a slave ship captain? What was stopping him? The passage. I have been informed that some commanders have cut off the legs or the arms of the most willful slaves to terrify the rest, for they believe that if they lose a member, they cannot return home again. I was advised by some of my officers to do the same, but I could not be persuaded to entertain the least thought of it, much less to put into practice such barbarity and cruelty to poor creatures who, accepting their want of Christianity and true religion, their misfortune more than their fault, are as much the works of God's hands, and no doubt as dear to him as ourselves. Again, the first question you want to answer, what are some of the punishments that people used on these trading ships for slaves who are resistant or rebellious? And second question, why wouldn't Captain Phillips do these things himself while he was a slave ship captain? What stopped him? I'll read it one more time. I have been informed that some commanders have cut off the legs or the arms of the most willful slaves to terrify the rest, for they believe that if they lose a member, they cannot return home again. I was advised by some of my officers to do the same, but I could not be persuaded to entertain the least thought of it, much less to put into practice such barbarity and cruelty to poor creatures who, accepting their want of Christianity and true religion, which was their misfortune more than their fault, are as much the works of the hands of God, and no doubt as dear to him as ourselves. Document 11. A sketch of people being forced to dance on a slave ship. Why would the crew on slave ships force the slaves to dance on the deck, sometimes during the voyage? You take a look at the picture, and it's of slaves being brought up from the bottom, and they're being danced, and they get put back down on the bottom of the deck. Frequently, slaves were permitted on deck in small groups for brief periods, where the crew would encourage and many times force the captives to dance for exercise. And we're actually going to show you guys a video clip of a scene like this from the series Roots or Amistad, and we'll talk about in class why they would be forced to dance on deck. Why would you dance the slaves? What's the purpose in that? Document 12. The Voyage, from the autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vasa the African, written by himself. So in this passage, you have 4 questions that you're going to answer. Here's question number 1. What made Equiano sick when he was placed on the bottom deck? From the passage, quote, I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the least desire to taste anything. I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me, but soon to my grief 2 of the white men offered me eatables, and on my refusing to eat, one of them held me fast by my hands, and tied my feet, while the other flogged or whipped me severely. This part also answers the second question. What happened to Olaudah Equiano when he refused to eat? In the next part of the passage, you're going to hear what caused many slaves to die below the deck, and you want to pick a detail from his voyage on the slave ship that stood out to you the most. Picking up in about the middle of the passage. The stench of the hold was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on the deck for the fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration, from a variety of loathsome smells, and brought on a sickness among the slaves of which many died. This wretched situation was again aggravated by the galling of the chains, and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated.